have you participate here with a team of ministers, deputy ministers, premiers, directors, generals, and other senior leaders in government and outside of government. We also thank Professor Mariana Mazzucato and the team at UCL for agreeing to be part of this masterclass series. This is a second masterclass in the series that we are hosting as the National School of Government. The first one was last year. We hosted Eric Lee from Fudan University. He was in conversation with Professor Marwana from the University of Johannesburg. It's a very exciting moment because the numbers are growing. We had the honor of having former President Kgalema Motlanthe, in fact, attending that one. These master classes are growing, in proportion and stature, and public servants are responding very positively to the opportunity to learn through these dialogues. We have another set of master classes that we are planning in the coming days. There's one for all HR practitioners in government. There's one on communicating pandemics that is also set for next month. And we're excited as the National School of Government that we're able to pull through these learning engagements for public servants, senior leaders, and members of parliament, and the public in general. This is the running order for the day, Mr. President. Minister and Prof. Mazzucato and all other leaders who are part of this session. We are hoping to have a dynamic interaction today. Fortunately, Prof. Mazzucato brought a team, so they will respond to some of the questions, and the President will then do reflections as well later on. And then Ms. Pindile Baleni, DG Gauteng, will do a vote of thanks. She's one of the participants in the executive program run by the NSG and the UCL. The biography of Prof. Mazzucato is here. We will share this on the chat platform. She's well known, and in fact, this lecture will be based on some of her most recent research and work, and we will share this biography with everybody. As the National School of Government, we've got flagship programs right now. We are recruiting already for some of the programs that we are showing here. The Economic Governance School will be running again. We had one last year with a number of ministers who were joining, led by the late Minister Jackson Mthembu. We are recruiting for the next cohort of UCL, as well as the Executive Development Program approved by Cabinet last year. We also recruiting HODs, accounting officers, municipal managers for that. Maybe I should say here, Mr. President, that on the program you see here, we ran with UCL. I must acknowledge the generous support from Anglo-American, the British High Commission, as well as Old Mutual. We went to them and sought a sponsorship in order to make it easier and affordable for public servants to join those programs. And so we acknowledge their support in that regard. In fact, even in the next cohort, we'll be raising more resources. Then to do the executive course at UCL becomes much more affordable for participants as well as the departments. Partnerships are the future for the National School of Government. So this is a strategy we have because we're growing in order to sharpen perspective of public servants. So this must sit in the context of our partnership strategy, which is helping to expose South African public servants to perspectives, from various corners of the world, so they can do better as senior managers and so on. These are the reason why we are arranging such masterclasses, because we're searching for the mandarins, for the leadership that can exercise, lead through ideas, not by rank. We want to cultivate talent, create space for innovation, and this class will be talking about that today. And also want to, build a capable cadre of public servants who can actually, lead digital transformation in their institutions, as well as engage in high-level financial planning and budgeting. This is our motto, Mr. President, and everybody attending. As the National School of Government, we say learn, serve, grow. The idea is we must expand learning opportunities for public servants to learn and, sharpen their statecraft. in order for them to serve better, because people who master statecraft tend to serve better, and we've put culture there because it also matters. And finally, we recognize that public servants have got aspirations to grow professionally, and as the National School of Government, our responsibility is to provide platforms for them to do so. Thank you very much once again for coming here. So we will now go to Minister Mchunu as our minister in the department, who will do the welcome. I will not be coming back after Minister Mchunu. It go to you, Mariana, and then the Honorable President will make an intervention and will facilitate the discussion. Thank you very much, and welcome to you all once again. Honorable Minister, over to you.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Mr. Ngaweni, and all the people at the National School of Government in South Africa. Good morning to you, Mr. President, and indeed it's an honor to have you in our midst. And it's indeed an honor to us that you are gracing the National School of Government with your presence and your input later on. You are most welcome. Other colleagues who may be here, and including the Deputy Minister, Deputy Ministers and the Deputy Minister in the DPSA. And I also want to extend my greetings to Mariana, and that it is indeed an honor as well to have you with us and visiting the school and addressing us later on. Not today, the difference is that it's not from your books, it's directly from you, and we're looking forward to it. Morning to the teachers and HODs who are here. I want to start by saying that right from the time just after elections, we set ourselves at DPSA, under whom the school falls, that we needed to turn the school around and reposition it for the role that it was designed for, to be a catalyst to bring about changes in the public sector in South Africa, but make its own contribution to the public sector in the world, but in particular to turn around the fortunes of the public sector, particularly public service in South Africa, from what it has become to what it should become, as was supposed to be the case. There's a lot of background work that we've had to do to turn the school around. And now we are on the march, but at the starting point of it. But we can see that it is promising that it will join the league of other national schools of government elsewhere and other institutions contributing to their countries like this one that would want to see contributing to improved governance in South Africa and improving our performance. We make as a starting point the fact that the public service, both in South Africa and elsewhere, has a lot to offer. I don't even want to say still has a lot to offer. I just want to say it has a lot to offer. And both from the historical perspective, which is indicated by facts in terms of the development of our country up to now, but also it has a contribution to make in terms of the current setup in this administration. But we are expecting a lot from the public sector in the near future, but also in the medium term and in the long-term future of the state in South Africa and for the public as a whole. So we're here to say it is a fact that all of us must embrace and accept that indeed we are a sector from whom a lot is expected, especially by the people of South Africa in their own situation, with a view to offering the better and making their lives better in the near future. Well, of course, there are many examples where the public sector in South Africa, meaning government, led initiatives and visions have played a crucial role in changing the fortunes of the people of South Africa. And notwithstanding problems in the short past, the legacy of which we still have, but the sector has stood out and has shown its resilience and promising even more, provided we seize the moment and take the new initiative that will take the public sector in South Africa to the higher height. Now, globally, I like what Mariana has to argue in one of her books, the topic of which is today, where she argues the point, even making an example of the Silicon Valley, how the public sector is contributing to that, and how the private sector is making a meal out of it. Not that we should be jealous and shout that down, but just showcase the contribution and the sterling contribution at that by the public sector. But globally, there's a lot to point to in terms of initiatives by the public sector, from initializing phase to practical projects, and thereby also producing enablers, which the private sector has taken advantage of. It happens very often. It happens also in our country. I come from a province called KwaZulu-Natal, and one of the things that have happened in the city of Durban there is done by the public sector, quite a huge bridge near Gateway, one of the shopping centers, an upcoming commercial activities area in the city of Durban. A multi-layer bridge which is heading for higher heights in terms of being a facilitator for development in that particular area. It's an enabler coming from government, but which the private sector can take advantage of and facilitate development in that area and in the whole of the province. In Gauteng and Johannesburg area, the road infrastructure that has been provided by the public sector in the short past has a lot to offer in terms of facilitating business and other related developments. So there is a case for the public sector to improve on its lot. I will come to that later on. Just now, this is all not to say that the private sector must stand down or must be relegated to the periphery, but it's merely to say that we need to work together, and the public sector has a role to play together with the private sector. What COVID-19, in my view, has done, among other things, is to bring a positive, some positivity to government in a situation globally where there have been growing doubts about the role of government. People arguing that, even academia, that the time for government is gone, We now want minimalist approaches from the side of government. Let the people go, let people do what they want to do without the confines of government. But COVID-19 has shifted the spotlight back to government all over the world. It has been government, this, government that, government this, government must do this, government must do that. Failing which COVID would have had a feast day. And I think the public sector, and including ourselves here in South Africa, we must seize the moment, use the spotlight that has been shifted to government, and make good out of that spotlight by enhancing the role of government positively. I'm not talking about power to manipulate. I'm talking about power to use the resources of the state for the development of humanity, for bettering the lives of the people, for improving even the lives of people who otherwise they themselves would have seen a reason to forget about their future. Government has to go there, revive the hope, and ensure that everybody enjoys life and improved life in their country of their birth. And therefore, under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, we have a lot to hope for, even at the time of COVID, that will overcome COVID and lead a long march to recovery, but also to better life for all in South Africa. But there are challenges, though, that we need to face and agree that we have to face these challenges head on. One of them is to enhance the integrity of government. What we have seen in South Africa in the past 5 to 7 years isn't something that we should take any pride of. While there may have been pockets of progress, but by and large, it has been a period that has made government look and smell very bad, I must say. This includes what is playing on at the Zondo Commission, displaying a public service and a public sector that has had a field day in corruption and thereby damaging the integrity of government. So we need to take that challenge and accept that it has been a disservice to good governance, which the majority of the people aspire for. And therefore, we take it as a challenge that in this administration, we need to turn things around. And the school is being called upon to make a contribution, and our repositioning of it to play a facilitative role to bring back the integrity of the public sector and public service in particular. We also have to improve accountability. We've had our guard lowered in this regard, and it hasn't helped. What is going to help us is to take accountability to our stride and say, and make it fashionable once more, where it has been unfashionable to be accountable, bringing about the lowering of stature of the state. But the third point is to increase competitiveness on our part. Not only must we compete with the private sector, but we must also compete internally via departments and in terms of the initiatives via a number of projects that the state is undertaking. Those who are made to lead those projects, to lead those departments, like the accounting officers in terms of HODs and DGs, and even the executive authorities, we must show our mettle at this point in time, and intensify competitiveness and innovation. Our DGs and our HODs have to double their effort in this regard and lead the forces and make sure that the public sector is once more competitive, and it plays its role in innovation. Of course, there are pockets of excellence here and there in health, in education, and so on, but we need to see more and move forward. We can't just make do with what is there without innovating and breaking the impasse and move on to higher heights. And so the state and the public sector as a whole has a role to play here. But there are these challenges that we have to overcome. So all the above actions need to be introduced vigorously to turn the public service around. We need to restore our glory as a public service, to which millions of people are still dependent, I must say. Quite a lot of people, urban, rural, young, old, they are still heavily dependent on the interventions by the public sector in their own daily lives to survive. And therefore, we have a role to play, and we need to perform that role with distinction, but with honesty, with the ethical standards that are required, of course, all of it present. So arguments, as I stand down, arguments exist or has existed in South Africa. And I am very much interested in this argument that says, yes, huge salaries for public servants, far above the standard of living of citizens of the country, and those the kind of salaries that would compete with the highest in the private sector will propel the public sector forward. I'm not convinced with this. I haven't seen it. I mean, we've had the public sector via SOEs in South Africa, whose CEOs have been ones and out with high salaries, even higher than those of the President of the Republic. But what have we seen out there from this practice? It has been the decline of the SOEs, that is the public sector companies. Some of them have actually fallen apart, and some of them are breathing heavily in debt and so on. So I would say, if it has been an experiment, it hasn't worked. And we have to get back to a situation where we have a balanced approach in terms of remuneration for our public servants. Yes, incentives are necessary and are needed, but incentives are different from paying huge salaries with the hope that competitiveness will emerge, that productivity, high productivity and high performance will automatically emerge from such a practice. It hasn't worked. What we need are human beings that are committed, human beings in the public sector that are indeed driven by the need to serve, that are driven by that motivation to see improvement, to see the country competing at a high level, to see the continent competing at a high level with their peers. And that is what we need. And of course, salaries that are reasonable. But I don't think that we've been sensitive to too high salaries, far higher than the standard of living of the majority of the people of South Africa, that have been a characteristic of remuneration of our public sector in the state companies. I'm not attacking it. I'm just saying that it is time to review this practice and come back to reasonable reviews and standards in terms of this. And we are getting there via the single public service and single public administration, of course, which will allow variations here and there. But all of us must be wanting to close gaps between the highest paid and the lowest paid. Of course, we are minding what's happening in the private sector, but even there, some of the salaries have been ridiculously high, looking at their peers and so on. It's something that we need to review. But our experience has been otherwise. So the challenge is there's still a lot that the public has to offer, but certain things must change. This is what I'm saying overall, highlighted by the above. And we're tackling some of these things and we're dealing them, but we're willing to learn from our peers in the continent, from other continents, learn in particular from people like Mariana and other opinion makers in the world, in the public sector, and who are willing to learn and are willing to make good out of it. So we need to adapt, among other things, to 4IR, which is a great facilitator even in the public sector. And therefore, the public sector has to embrace 4IR and make it a way of doing things going forward. But the final thing that we have to stamp out of the public sector, particularly in South Africa, is corruption. It has damaged us to a point where it has even obliterated some of the efforts that we've been doing since mid-2019. People are still have a hangover that government is by nature corrupt, that the public sector officials, both elected and appointed, are corrupt, even though we are busy making efforts to turn the tide on corruption. But I'm convinced that sooner or later, people will be liberated from this perception, and South Africa as a whole will be liberated from the cloud of corruption and will emerge once more as a country promoting good governance, free of corruption, but driven by ethics and high standards of integrity. That's where we want to get to, and showcase our public sector as a country. With this principle, and President, thank you very much. You are all welcome. Thank you very much. Ngiyabonga.
Thank you, Minister. Mariana, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Minister. Your words really set a perfect context. Thank you, Principal Buzani, for organizing this event. And thank you so much to President Ramaphosa for being our student today. I have learned so much by being part of the President's Economic Advisory Council with other wonderful colleagues. And this is a wonderful moment where we bring the training and the rethinking policy together. I'm here actually with my team from the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose from University College London, where we have just undertaken a really inspirational set of weeks with your team at the National School of Government through a customized executive education program, really trying to do exactly, Minister, what you were talking about, which is this is not about state or the private sector. This is about actually how to work together in a different way. But we can't just talk about that. It has to be embedded within the training itself. We find, for example, that most masters in public administrations globally are, continue to be wed by this idea of the state at best for fixing market failures. But everything we have ahead of us, from governing the COVID pandemic to fighting climate change, to thinking about problems like the digital divide, they require co-creation and co-shaping of the economy between public, private, civil society organizations like trade unions are very important. And unfortunately, this is not embedded within the current curriculum. So what we've tried to do is really to rewrite the curriculum for global civil servants around 4 principles around rethinking value. Literally, the theory of value, where does economic value come from? Second, bringing the notion of public purpose and challenge-oriented thinking to the center of policy design. Third, looking within our bureaucracies and turning them into creative bureaucracies. There's no reason that the word bureaucratic should be a negative word. We just have the wrong bureaucracies, right? But we can have dynamic, agile, flexible bureaucracies. What do they look like? And fourth, the digital technologies, AI, big data, and so on, these aren't just out there as some sort of deterministic technology. They really have to be governed for the public good. So the fourth module that we have is about design and the digital transformation, which is very much about governing innovation for the public interest. Anyway, it's been fantastic to work with the many different civil servants within South Africa through this executive education program that we very much also designed with Principal Busani. So let me move on now. I'm going to share my screen, which is always the most dangerous moment when your emails appear, but they haven't. Very good. So now let me put it on the Zoom. There we go. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so what I'd like to do, which is very much in the title of today's session, is to rethink government. Not because government is more important than any other actor, as the minister was just saying, this is about public and private working together, but really because the challenges that we currently have are very hard to govern if we have the wrong framing of what the state is for. And I do want to also say that, kind of going back to first principles, when we talk about the economy, when we talk about the market, we need to remember that the market itself is an outcome of how we govern all the different organizations and actors in the economy that co-create value. And what I'll be highlighting is we need to rethink that governance, both for government and the private sector, but especially in countries like South Africa, but I can tell you definitely in the UK, where I'm standing today, and also my own country, where I was born, in Italy, where we have lots of different problems. We need to think about the relationship, a new type of relationship between public and private. We need dynamic, mutualistic, symbiotic partnerships, and ones that really galvanize and catalyze as much cross-sectoral and cross-actor investment in innovation in the economy. And for this reason, I will be beginning, don't worry, I won't finish with it, but beginning with an inspirational thing that happened 50 years ago when humanity managed to get up to the moon and back in a very short amount of time. And I will be talking about the Apollo mission because I use it really as a metaphor in my new book called Mission Economy, which again, it's a huge honor to be able to be giving a book talk to your government, but it's much more than that. It's about the thinking that we require, which IIPP has been working with you on. But really, this is about asking, what can we learn from the intra-organizational dynamics that occur within governments when they are purpose-driven, when there's a strong sense of public value and public purpose and clear targets that we're trying to achieve. And I think, as you'll see, that it really goes to the heart of many of the things that the minister was talking about. And the context, of course, all of us, globally are currently living through one of the greatest challenges that we've lived through in our lifetime, which is this COVID pandemic. And unfortunately, it's really shown just how many governments, how many states are too weak. This concept of weak states is sometimes overly used for certain types of countries. Well, we've just seen it to be a general problem in terms of the failure of different countries to really deliver on some basic things like personal protection equipment for frontline workers. There's no point in calling them essential workers if we don't know how to value them, if we don't know how to pay them properly, if we don't know how to resource the institutions, the health systems within which they work. It's an insult to be clapping our health workers if we're not resourcing the value-creating organizations within which they lie. And unfortunately, it's been revealed just how weak our health systems are globally. We have different challenges that have popped up with COVID, including the digital divide, which has really increased inequality during this period because, of course, many students locked down at home. They simply don't have equal access to the powers, if you want, of modern day digital platforms. And this is just as true within London as it is true in Johannesburg. This inequality, which in many ways has been the source of different types of crises we have, but also the outcomes. And it's really a moment, to ask ourselves what we've learned. And we have, by the way, a new report coming out with the UNDP looking precisely at different countries and what we can learn. Because what has been really interesting is also how some countries in the developing world, for example, the state of Kerala and Vietnam, have actually done quite well. Now, not perfectly, no one's done perfectly, but on the back of actually having made investments within their public administrations in the last 2 decades, they proved to actually have been more prepared in terms actually of galvanizing that public, private, third sector, civil society partnership that one needs during this moment. And it's not a coincidence that they did well. You have to look back at the sorts of investments that they made, again, within the public administration, but also in terms of fostering trust between civil society and government, we know is essential. We see this, by the way, today with the vaccine. When people don't trust science or trust their government ministers, they will, for example, not trust the benefits of something like the vaccine. And communication is, of course, incredibly important. The COVID pandemic, as we all know, is on the back of multiple different types of crises. The financial crisis, just 20 years ago, is still feeling its ills globally. Many countries never managed to bounce back. And in fact, we still have sources of dysfunctionality within our financial systems that produced that financial crisis in the first place. But the big, really kind of pending crisis we have behind us is the climate one, global warming. And when we talk about the green transition, the just transition, the need for sustainability and a transformation, not just of energy, but all of our sectors, we have to realize that we need to do it also quickly. We cannot just sit there and philosophize. As Greta Thunberg says, if your house is on fire, you don't sit there and debate and make a list of what to do, you get the hell out. Well, unfortunately, we're not getting out of this at speed. And by speed, I mean the speed that we've been told by the IPCC that we need to move. So we have less than 10 years left. And yet, even just in 2019, huge amount of subsidies in the EU, went, for example, to fossil fuel companies. And during the COVID pandemic, over 56% of the recovery funds ended up going to fossil fuel projects. So, this doesn't feel like we're building back better in any way. But also we should remember that as a global, community, 6 years ago, we committed to change. Every country, South Africa, the UK, Brazil, et cetera, signed up to these incredible 17 goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll be coming back to them because I really think we can apply what we call a mission-oriented approach to them. But for now, these 17 challenges, unfortunately, if you look at all the different metrics, and the UN has developed different metrics, also different organizations, we are not, again, moving fast enough in all sorts of different areas, in terms of poverty, hunger, well-being, quality education, and the inequalities in our education systems, gender equality, and so on. We are not moving at pace. And in some cases, we're actually getting worse. So again, what do we do? So what I want to first argue here in the minutes I've been given is why we need to be careful not to just look at these symptoms of the problems that we're facing right now, but the source. And precisely in order to do what the minister was saying, which was to rethink the public service, to rethink the private sector, their interrelationships, and to make us more purpose-driven, we have to, first at least admit just, how problematic some of our structures are in terms of the different key categories. And I will focus very quickly on finance, the business sector, and the government sector. And of course, these are very broad generalizations that I will be making, but on trend, if we look at the global trends, the problems that I'll be raising, I think have to focus our lenses on change within our structures, because you cannot have better policy and better outcomes if it does not go to the center of the structural organizations and their governance relationships. So the first one is just what we observe around the global financial sector. And this is, again, a trend that different South African colleagues have also shown to be the case in South Africa, is just how our financial sector has been basically financing, to a large extent, itself. And FIRE means fire, insurance, and finance, insurance, and real estate. So if you look at, these are UK figures for the Bank of England, in the UK, something like 80% of our finance just goes back to those 4 areas: finance, insurance, and real estate. And this very much actually helped to fuel the financial crisis, of course, because if you are simply putting out credit and thinking that somehow that's going to solve the problem without also making sure we're directing our economy, for example, to be a less financialized one, then what you get is just a lot of, finance, a lot of impatient finance, which can also help fuel things like housing bubbles. And in South Africa itself, there's been different types of studies. This is also based on some work that my colleague who's on the Zoom today, Antonio Andreoni, has done. There's also been, if you want, financialization in terms of the banks, in terms of the amount of money that's actually reaching the real economy versus going back into those sectors. And of course, reaching the real economy itself is not enough. As I will be arguing in a minute, we need to make sure that what is being financed in the real economy is in fact moving that economy towards the direction that we want, a more inclusive and sustainable economy. There's also work by one of my colleagues in the President's Economic Advisory Council, Ayabonga Kawe, who's looked, for example, also at the proportion of profits that are being earned by different South African banks. But I'm telling you, this is true globally. That has really been coming also increasingly from just moving around existing assets. And you can see this with non-interest income sources, which are often those that, for example, capture capital gains. And this is not an accusation of South African banks. You see this really worldwide. My previous book on value looked at this in terms of the distinction between value creation and value extraction. And so again, this is sort of a big warning call for our global financial systems to make sure that, in fact, if we want to reach these goals, that we also get a real sense of where are profits actually coming from. And that distinction between profits and rents has unfortunately also been lost in terms of how we do the economics. Second, business, and this is not meant to be, again, accusing global business of being bad. But if we look at the data, and I really believe in evidence-based thinking, if we look at the data, what we see is an increasing globally proportion of profits not being reinvested back into the economy, but actually being, again, extracted out in terms of share buybacks, dividend payouts, and so on. And this work here is from a colleague, Bill Lazonik, who's worked on this quite a bit. We also published together on it, looking at the fall in that reinvestment cycle. And why is this important? When you hear about things like the robots are taking our jobs, well, that's not true. Robots are just sitting there waiting to be commanded, right? Robots have been taking jobs, in fact, for 200 years in terms of mechanization, the Industrial Revolution. It has been labor displacing for 200 years. But as long as the profits being earned were reinvested back into the economy, then new jobs, new skills, new economic activity appeared, what Schumpeter called creative destruction. What we've seen globally since the 1980s, so this is quite recent compared to the 200 years of global industrial revolutions, is that kind of fall in that reinvestment due to this overemphasis on just maximizing shares. And again, if you look at the data in South Africa, and this is also some work from my colleague Antonio Andreoni, but also Ayabonga has also looked at this. We can look at different sectors, and mining in particular in South Africa is susceptible, if you want, to some of these problems in terms of the lack of reinvestment, and we need to address this, and perhaps we can do so towards the end, when I will argue that we really need to be thinking about the transformation, right, of sectors, not just handing out money, bailouts, whether it's for steel or other sectors. We need to think, how can we actually use that public-private relationship towards also creating certain types of dynamic conditions, which in the very least should be about reinvestment. And secondly, reinvesting in areas that really transform our economies to be, again, greener and more inclusive. And what's interesting is globally, this has been recognized as a problem, right? President Ramaphosa and I met, when was that? 3 years ago at Davos. And Davos is, the jet set place where everyone talks about these wonderful things like purpose and stakeholder value and, the mea culpa moments where shareholder maximization is seen, rightly so, as having caused many problems. Well, what does it actually mean then to transform the type of capitalism we have in this stakeholder capitalism kind of way that Larry Fink from BlackRock, but also these business roundtable executives 2 years ago came out saying, we need change. And I fear to say again, as I did with climate change, that change is currently not moving fast enough. But the fact that this is being at least talked about, there is a talk about purpose-driven business. There is this notion of stakeholder value, which of course means that the value that's created also gets reinvested back into our communities, into workers, better working conditions, our planet, to make it livable, more sustainable. That's a very important discussion for us to hold on to when we look at this redesign requirement that we need, which I will argue in South Africa is absolutely critical, but it is also in every other place I know. And third, I'm still on this initial, if you want, proclamation of how we need to rethink everything. Governments, right? It's not just finance, it's not just business. Governments themselves, unfortunately, have increasingly, I would argue, become weak in many parts of the world because we have bought into this idea that at best, government is there to fix a problem. So you actually, in some ways, have to wait for problems to arrive in order to do anything. And the way that economists talk about this is the need to fix market failures. It's a very important concept, but it's not enough. These market failures around coordination failures, negative externalities like pollution, positive externalities like the benefits of, say, publicly funded research and development, these are all there because there's not enough often research and development. We have too much pollution. We have massive coordination failures, too little investment during busts, often, problematic types of investments in booms. They themselves can be seen as coordination failures. We have asymmetric information, which means SMEs get too little financing. All these failures exist. But if the point is to transform an economy, to be more inclusive, to be more sustainable, to be more investment driven, to be more innovation driven, to actually achieve these very important goals that the SDGs set ourselves, you cannot patch your way there. There is no number of bandages that you can have to transform an economy that will lead to incremental change. So the actual tools that we require for radical transformational change are often not there. And that's not inevitable. That's because of the design challenge, which again, the minister very much focused on. And it was so curious in the UK during COVID, where also on the back of Brexit, a lot of numbers started to appear of just how much the UK government, and again, I really argue this is true globally, has overly outsourced its own competence to the private sector. We all know government has to work with the private sector, but if you're outsourcing your brain to the private sector, often in some countries to consulting companies like PwC, Deloitte, and so on, that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because we learn by doing. You learn how to ride a bike by falling off that bike and getting back on. If we believe, as the minister was saying, that the public sector is too weak, has become too bureaucratic, has become too captured, has become corrupt, we need to change that public sector. We can't just give up on it and outsource, activities. How public and private work together is absolutely critical, but if within the public sector itself, we do not have dynamic capabilities, which really go to the core of the executive education program that we've been embarking with the National School of Government, capabilities about thinking in a portfolio thinking kind of way, capabilities in terms of thinking of cultural changes within our institutions so that they welcome risk-taking, but they also learn from the failures, that kind of learning by doing. Capabilities in terms of how to design, procurement, grants and loans to be as creating of additionality as possible in the economy, catalyzing investment and innovation and activity across a broad array of sectors, then we have a problem. And so what it is that we're actually outsourcing is important, and outsourcing the capabilities themselves can risk to infantilize government. And this is the term that was said by this man here, who's a lord, a Tory lord in the UK government. And he was looking at the data that was coming out, how much we had outsourced Brexit and COVID. In particular, we had outsourced the test and trace system to Deloitte, very interesting, and called this, alarm bell. And so really what I want to do is to argue that in order to achieve a stronger, more capable, more creative government, in order to foster dynamic, mutualistic, public-private partnerships, we have to be willing to question our underlying assumptions, which are often encrusted in our thinking, which then create a problematic government structures, problematic business structures, and problematic relationships. And I'm going to move on a bit quicker now because I think we started a bit late, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. But in one of the chapters of my new book, I really kind of go through all these problematic assumptions, some that have to do with value, that the idea that wealth is created inside business, and at best, the government can come in and facilitate and enable that process, as important as that is itself a problem. We need to be creating value-creating public institutions as well. And that means we need to think what it means to create public value. We've been working, for example, with the BBC as an organization, because they themselves have this concept of public value, which has actually led them to be quite risk-taking and creating new markets very much in their space, as opposed to believing that at best a public broadcaster can do the programs that a private broadcaster doesn't do. They have redesigned or reimagined even what a soap opera is, what a talk show is. EastEnders, a soap opera about the working class, not Dynasty in Dallas about the 1%. That required an internal discussion within that public institution about the value they were actually trying to create. But yet there's so little learning from that, even in the UK, between the public institutions in terms of that process they went through. This idea, again, that markets at best can be fixed by governments as opposed to co-created and co-shaped to serve public interests. These old ideas about efficiency, that governments need to be run like a business and save money, as opposed to actually also coming up with better metrics for dynamic efficiency. If government is successful, it's creating dynamic spillovers across the economy. Do we have metrics for that? Cost benefit analysis and net present value calculations, I will argue, would have stopped the moon landing from day one. Well, any of those SDGs require really bold thinking. We better make sure we have the equivalent metrics to make sure that we've achieved not only the missions, but those dynamic spillovers. I've already talked about this problem about capabilities, but also the terms that we use in terms of what government is for, leveling the playing field, right? No, we need to tilt the playing field towards a direction, which doesn't mean picking winners, one sector, one technology, one kind of firm, say an SME, but very much picking the willing. Who's willing to engage with the societal transformation? What does it mean for state-owned enterprises? What does it mean for large old sectors like the steel sector or new types of services in our digital economies? That's not very useful to talk about leveling the playing field. We need to first decide where we want to go and then transform the instruments to bring as many with us as possible. And the reason I look at the Apollo program, which is not a good, if you want, metaphor exactly for these more social challenges, is that it actually, if we look at what it required for government to change how it was thinking in order to be as bold as getting a man to the moon and back again in a few years, they managed it even in less than a decade, which is what Kennedy had set out. That required a redesign in the public sector. It required radical new thinking about how to relate with the many, many businesses that engaged NASA with that project. And it required a lot of learning along the way. There was lots of failure, as we know, of course, from the Apollo 1 disaster. But the level of leadership, that Kennedy set out, and I do want to come back to this point because I don't think this is about one guy, one minister, one ministry, but leadership also in terms of getting as much also engagement by different actors in this process ex ante. But the level of leadership that he really voiced in 1962 in Rice Stadium, saying we will go to the moon because it's hard, not because it's easy. No one talks like that. No one says that even about climate change. We're going to do it. It's going to be hard. It's worth it. Of course, we're going to screw up along the way. It's going to cost a lot of money, but it's worth it, right? The level of risk-taking and innovation that was required within public institutions themselves, the needed change in organizational structures to be more agile, flexible, knowing when to turn the tap off is just as important as knowing when to turn it on in terms of finance. The need to really create as many different spillovers. As the minister kindly mentioned, my other book, The Entrepreneurial State, looked at how all the technologies that are actually inside our smart products that make them smart and not stupid actually came from many of these mission-oriented programs as spillovers, right? No one thought about the internet. The internet was the solution to a problem. The problem was getting the satellites to communicate. How we frame our problems today, if we frame them as ambitiously as possible, can actually foster a lot of spillovers in organizational, social, and technological innovations, but also the idea that finance was there to serve an outcome. It wasn't like, all right, how much money do we have? What can we do with that money? No, it was like, that's the goal, and working backwards and having this outcomes-focused finance, and remembering that, just like we see now with COVID, money does come out of the woodwork when we decide that we need to do something by any means necessary, but how can we kind of institutionalize that kind of thinking, become an outcomes, results focused way of thinking about our budgets? And the partnerships. We need partnerships with purpose. There's no sector like the health sector that can tell you how not to do this, right? Better. So, in the United States, for example, we spend, I'm also a US citizen, $40 billion a year on health innovation. And yet somehow we haven't bothered, the government spends that much, to make sure that the prices of the drugs reflect that collective creation, that the design of the intellectual property rights reflects that collective creation of health innovation. So partnerships with purpose need to also be governed in terms of intellectual property rights, design of the collaborations with purpose. And that's why I really believe this useful concept of stakeholder value needs to not just be a corporate governance change, it needs to go at the center of how the system is designed. So a purpose-driven, stakeholder value-driven way of partnering. And when they began, they had no clue how to get to the moon. If you look at the early documents, they fudged this big time. They're like, yeah, we're gonna go, no idea, what should we do? So there was lots of different ways to get there. They finally agreed on the lunar orbit rendezvous, but that willingness to embark on a project, which they knew was gonna be extremely hard, itself is fascinating. But even more so, because it was hard and not easy, as Kennedy said, one of the first things they did was change how they worked. You will know, all of the civil servants in the room today, in the Zoom call today, will know that one of the big problems that governments have, and I see this again with every government I've worked with, there's too much siloed departmental thinking. Every department kind of does its own thing. In the UK, even though we have gov.uk, a wonderful digital platform for a government, somehow each department still thinks within its own way in terms of digitalization. That is changing. But anyway, this need to get departments to be much more horizontal in how they're working, and the treasuries especially. I don't know if the Minister of Finance is with us today, but the Treasury itself working more horizontally with the other departments. So if we want innovation-led green growth, well, the Treasury, the Department of Energy and Sustainability, and other departments interested in these transformations need to work together. So the concept of green is at the center of our economic model, not sort of on the periphery. Bringing the peripheral areas to the center to direct an economy requires much more horizontal communication. And it was so interesting where one of the astronauts who died on the Apollo 1 fire, Gus Grissom, he was having a really hard time hearing anything that was being said by the mission control room. And he shouted, this was just hours before he and the other two astronauts died. He's like, how the hell are we going to get to the moon? We can't even talk here within a square kilometer between 2 or 3 buildings. And that idea that if you are going to be purpose-driven, you need to also have a purpose-driven organization, is key. And it was actually George Mueller, who came from Bell Labs, who helped with this redesign and having, given kind of key, project managers, delegation, but also, having teams, and then having the different project managers constantly talking to each other instead of working in a little silo. And this is the next bit that I just found so fascinating in doing some of the research. NASA was confident about its role. It didn't want to micromanage everyone. That kills innovation. A top-down state kills innovation. We know the Soviet system didn't work. So let's just kind of get beyond that point, right? So what NASA did was they very much directed the show, but worked very dynamically with, hundreds of businesses actually. The total, I think, was like 400,000 people were somehow involved, to make the moon landing work. But how they partnered mattered. And I'm going to come back to this towards the end. With South Africa, they changed their procurement contracts. And let's not forget, procurement in every country is a big chunk of your budget. There's no such thing as we don't have money. You got money, you just got to change how it's spent. So procurement in terms of the demand side, right? Not just government investment and things like, the internet, but the demand side that any hospital, school, Department of Transport does is often a very large part of its budget. In the UK, I know because I work with the government on this, the whole innovation budget of the UK government is £10 billion. Just the procurement budget of the Ministry of Transport is 40 billion. So, imagine transforming the procurement budget of all the different ministries, health, environment, transport, and so on, to be one of the levers for innovation, investment, and partnership. But NASA was careful to design it in such a way that it created the right partnership. They changed it from cost plus contracts, which just really inflated costs because anything kind of goes and was easily gamed, to fixed price contracts with constant incentives for innovation and continual quality improvement. So that kind of designing procurement to reach a goal, but to foster also a sharing of responsibilities and profits was important, because they didn't want to just be paying out any bill that came their way. And they even, get this, I just was shocked to find this, they had no excess profits clauses in the procurement contracts. And so that doesn't mean no profits. Of course, industry has to make profits, but hey, this is on the back of a collective ecosystem. Let's make sure that it's not becoming a gambling casino. And by the way, I do think space today is becoming a gambling casino. If you see what's happening there, it's not really being directed as a proper ecosystem. The astronauts are saying, we can't see anything. There's too much debris, right? We just are bringing in the private sector, which of course is needed, but without proper rules of engagement and turning it into a cash machine where, people like Elon Musk, make billions from that, fantastic. But however, if it's on the back of a public infrastructure, NASA, the International Space Station, and so on, what might a better form of partnership be? And it's never about the state or the private sector. It's always about both, but engaging in ways that, prevent corruption and so on. And on this issue of corruption, which, I know in South Africa you talk about a lot, but can I just say, I think Italy taught you. I mean, we are the top, the mafia, corruption, et cetera. So you can't take your, you can't say that you're winners on that. So, I come from a country which has a lot of problems within the government in terms of, we had a whole process of mani pulite, where there was quite a bit of, backroom deals and corruption inside the Italian government. This is, true of many different governments, but how do you tackle that? One of the things that, NASA was aware of is that if they themselves are not ambitious, if they themselves are not knowledgeable, if they themselves are not confident about their role, the possibilities of corruption and capture, they mainly talked about capture, was even higher. And there was this head of procurement, Ernest Brackett, who said, if we don't invest within our own knowledge creation mechanism and have metrics like the ones I mentioned about the BBC, obviously he didn't talk about the BBC, but that kind of public value, public purpose metrics, dynamic spillover metrics, and so on. And if we don't understand the areas where we're investing, we will lose, our own capabilities, and we will end up being conned into doing things just from brochuremanship. So at the time, they didn't have PowerPoints. So they talked about brochuremanship as, a government needing to understand its environment as opposed to just, outsourcing its brain. What in management speak, by the way, is called absorptive capacity. By investing, whether it's the private or the public sector, in your own dynamic capabilities, you increase your absorptive capacity to understand your environment and to really interact with it in a dynamic way. And it was just so interesting they cared about that. lots of different things happen by being so careful on these dynamic relationships, many spillovers, whether it's camera phones, foil blankets, even diapers and baby formula. Many of these innovations actually came from that incredible moon landing. But also what's interesting here, and I'm going to come to this, focus on it in my last minutes, so many different sectors. It was not just aeronautics. It was investment in nutrition, in materials, in electronics. The whole software industry was very much a spillover of that. So what does it mean to have missions today, whether it's on carbon neutral cities, whether it's a plastic-free ocean, whether it's zero knife crime in a city like London, which has been facing a real epidemic around knife crime around underprivileged kids, teenagers, basically. What does it mean to look at any of these missions in an intersectoral way? So instead of just pretending that knife crime is, say, problem for crime, to look at it, say, through also public health lens and get as many different sectors to work together on that problem. What does it mean to look at the future of mobility with sectors as different as construction, transport, nutrition, obviously bringing in new design thinking together. So, if we think of the moonshot as just one big project that was funded, we're completely missing the point. It was really economy-wide in terms of so many different sectors that were required at the table, and that attention that NASA paid and how it was actually organizing those partnerships. And yes, it cost a lot of money, but as Kennedy already knew, it was going to cost less than what we pay for cigarettes and cigars every year. But this also is so important today with the COVID recovery funds, whether it's the $2 trillion that Biden will be spending, whether it's the $1 trillion in the EU next gen recovery package, whether it's the South African one. What matters is not just looking at the money itself, but how it actually then lands on different types of organizations. And that dynamic, decentralized network of different types of public organizations that are essential to be working with different types of private organizations across that whole innovation chain, that really matters in terms of actually then fostering the kind of spillover and multiplier effect that we have. This is not about helicopter money. This is about also much smarter types of engagement. And of course, as I already began, in the beginning, the moon landing is not necessarily how we are thinking today when we have, such clear problems on Earth, whether it's COVID, climate, and equality. But those lessons about being bold, being clear what the target is, having government lead, but not micromanage, lead towards a direction, make those early stage investments in particular areas that can then really crowd in the business sector, but also that really careful partnership to make sure in the no excess profits kind of way is truly symbiotic. Those lessons are very important if we are going to take seriously these SDGs. And so one of the things that we've been working on with different governments really is that kind of mission mapping. And this was part of the course, again, that we did with Principal Busani and the team there at the National School of Government. I'm very interested in continuing that discussion because we're learning a lot about what does it mean, for example, to redesign an industrial strategy. In South Africa, you have an industrial strategy. Every country has an industrial strategy or should have an industrial strategy, often doesn't. But when they do, it's important. It learns from everything I've just said, not to be a list of sectors, random sectors we might make up as being important, but really being problem focused and bringing all the different sectors together. In the UK, for example, we had a sector list that was aerospace, automotive, life sciences, creative sector, and financial services. To do what, right? Why not, 20 other sectors I can think of, including steel? How can we create missions that really require cross-sectoral innovation, but also that bottom-up experimentation? What does it mean to welcome the experimentation process itself? These are just kind of different examples that I used in a report that I wrote for the European Commission, on the back of which this concept of missions was actually voted on by the Parliament and the Council. And Europe itself has now set itself 5 mission areas where they're implementing different portfolios of missions within each one. But this idea, again, of a carbon neutral city requiring, sectors as different as food, construction, environment, and then crowding in different projects from the business community, of which many will fail, right? I often remind the US government the same amount of money they gave to Solyndra was given to Tesla. The taxpayer came in and bailed out Solyndra, and no one knows that that same kind of Tesla investment was made during the Obama administration when they were trying to fuel that green recovery after the financial crisis. Well, you will have to admit that some of these processes will fail. So what does it mean, again, to have a portfolio approach around those different projects that are on the bottom there? And instead of thinking of the types of firms, like an SME financing tool, well, if it is going to be an SME, they will need extra support. But what are we actually trying to even fuel in our economies in terms of redesigning our innovation policy, industrial strategy, procurement, and so on? Missions, we need to be clear what they are. It's not supposed to just replace the word kind of project or even challenge. They should be bold and inspirational, have a clear direction, be ambitious while realistic, but really catalyze, as I've been emphasizing, that cross-sectoral, interdisciplinary interaction and investment and drive up those bottom-up solutions. It really does require this proactive portfolio approach. And the second report that I wrote with the team really focused on the governance structure. What does it mean also in terms of accountability and evaluation? When should you turn the tap off? One of the organizations that we know has been most mission-oriented in the world, DARPA, one of its secrets is both that kind of intra-organizational culture of risk-taking, but also having dynamic metrics of not just sticking with a project because someone decided on it and their career is based on it, but also really making sure that if we are mission-oriented, we know that you've got to start admitting when things aren't working. So that ability within government institutions to pivot, to flexibly change. I've already mentioned this work we did with the UK industrial strategy. The idea was, instead of thinking of random sectors, think of big challenges: clean growth, future mobility, AI and the data economy. These three for sure are just as relevant in South Africa. And we then worked with them to transform these challenges into this, again, intersectoral approach that would mean that transport, health and well-being, inclusive design, financial and legal services would be coming together to work with the government on this future mobility strategy. But they then had to, in the same way that NASA redesigned, they had to redesign procurement, grants, and loans. And one of the things they also had to redesign, which we worked with them on in the Treasury, was rewriting the Green Book. The Green Book is the way that the UK Treasury looks at evaluation of publicly funded projects. And as I mentioned, had the moon landing been evaluated through cost benefit or net present value, they would have never begun. That doesn't mean we don't ever need cost benefit, but it does mean that when you have ambitious missions like that, both the ex ante and the ex post evaluation is critical. And also, one of the points I bring up in the book is, this issue of citizen engagement and making sure that this isn't just, a top-down mission, but really bringing different voices to the table. And at the time of the moon landing, there was, of course, Jill Scott Heron, who on his famous poem and song, Whitey's on the Moon, really raised this issue of, why are we going to the moon when we have all these problems on Earth? Dick Nelson, a colleague of mine, wrote a book back in 1977, The Moon in the Ghetto. Why have we managed to do that and we can't even solve the concrete problems on Earth? Structural racism, structural inequality, and so on. And I do think there's something about the recent decade that we've had, or even fewer, right? It's about 3 years, that we've had a global discussion around Black Lives Matter, around Fridays for the Future. So children striking on Fridays because they care about climate, the Me Too movement, and so on. There is an opportunity to really bring social movements also to the table here. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that without labor unions, we wouldn't have some of the best innovations ever. The weekend, the 8-hour workday, children not working in factories. These social innovations, which formed the kind of market outcomes we have today, came about when we actually had, again, I don't want to say partnership because it wasn't, harmonious, but when we allowed processes of economic growth also to interact with steering that growth to be, again, more inclusive, but also listening, right? Even in World War II, that transformation of automobile production to wartime production would not have happened without labor unions actually helping to foster and negotiate that process. So whether it's the green movement, the labor movement, women's movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, this is an opportunity today to bring those voices to the table, to design the projects themselves, not just to react to them, to be more just, but for the project design, the planning phase. And Sweden is an interesting example because they have at a very high level a challenge of a fossil-free welfare state. They've landed it on everything government does. And again, I think this is something really interesting for many of the ministers in the room. They've landed it also in areas like public education. What does it mean to have school meals that are healthy, tasty, and sustainable? So the whole value chain of school meal production becomes a lever. In that way, I was saying procurement can become a lever for fostering carbon neutrality and bringing school children and students to the table through also their curriculum learning around carbon neutrality and sustainability and global warming, but also literally to the table of designing those meals. They also have this interesting street mission. They have 40,000 kilometers of streets, and they're trying to take this place-based approach of a 1-minute street where all the key things you need are close by, but again, bringing citizens and local policymakers and businesses like Volvo or Voice Scooters to the table to think about that sustainable street mission together. In Camden, where I live, outside of my window here, it's a part of London, we've been working very closely with Georgia Gould and the Camden Council on really local missions, including ones that have to do with youth crime, but also carbon neutrality seen at the locus of the housing estates themselves, and bringing housing associations, residents, and citizen assemblies as part of that process of co-creation. But also, again, coming back to this issue of food, what does it mean to have, for example, a goal of by 2030, everyone has 3 nutritious, affordable, and sustainable meals a day, in looking at this through an industrial strategy lens. So really, we're bringing the welfare state and the innovation state together, because too often these are in different rooms. Lastly, just because I know the criticism that often comes, let's not go back to ideology, please, right? None of what I'm talking about is picking, it's just putting in a lot of public money from helicopters. No, it's about building smarter state, even with existing money. In many cases, we do need more money, especially around areas like healthcare, but it really is about that redesign challenge with which I know that the president, the principal, and the minister all believe in. It's not about picking winners. It's not a big HS2 project. It's not about the Concorde. It's about transformation. Choosing challenges, turning the challenges into missions, and having a portfolio approach, which is intersectoral and that bottom-up projects, right? And it really does mean picking the willing, transforming at the design level our tools to do so. And it's not about ideology. This is not about, socialism, capitalism. It's very much about solving problems together, and there's many of them. But it's also, I dare say, to govern that process in the name of citizenry, to make sure people benefit. That itself has to be at the co-design phase. We've worked very closely. I'm actually now going to be chairing a council for the World Health Organization called the Economics of Health for All. And how we govern vaccine production to make sure that the patents are not used for value extraction, a term I talked about in the beginning, how we govern partnerships between the Pfizers and the governments of the world to really fuel collective intelligence, so that as much knowledge sharing occurs, but also that we don't have what Dr. Tedros called vaccine apartheid, in terms of the hoarding of dosages in some countries. This means that how we govern these processes really, really matter. It's not just the vaccine, but how the vaccine is governed. And the COVID moment also presents us with this really interesting opportunity, and I really welcome you in South Africa to take it on, which is to create more conditionality, both between the public and the private sector, but also public and public. In Europe right now, the Next Gen EU plan will be a European recovery that goes to member states, conditional on the member states having a strategy and a plan for climate and the digital divide. And in some countries, this here is the Minister of Finance in France, who you see, they have also created conditionality. So sectors like automobiles and airlines were only able to access the recovery funds if they were willing and committed to reducing their carbon emissions. In Scotland, in Denmark and Austria, the conditions were, you've got to pay your tax. Any company that is abusing its power by using tax havens, can't access the recovery funds. And I think we need to frame this not as conditionality, because that reminds us of kind of Washington consensus kinds of words, but really building back better, having a new social contract, and having conditionalities, in terms of public-private, public-public is I think really interesting in South Africa, especially because the state also owns, for example, different types of state-owned enterprises. But what does it mean to have a relationship with state-owned enterprises, which aren't necessarily just about ownership of stuff, but a process through transforming those sectors is embedded within the relationship itself, which also comes to the point of budgeting. How can a budget, in that NASA kind of way, be catalytic in terms of transformation instead of just hands out subsidies, guarantees? And again, I can tell you that in Italy, a lot of the problems we have is not so much a small state, but a state that was just a handout machine. And very different, by the way, from what's happened recently in Germany, where its own public bank, for example, lent to the steel sector in Germany, conditional on steel committing to lowering its material content, which it did through repurpose, reuse, recycle. It is today one of the most innovative steel sectors, not because it went to Davos, but the condition to access the bailout from the government was that it had to transform. Let me just finish here, because I do want to stop. And just to say, I think there's a real opportunity in South Africa to take on this mission-oriented approach. It requires purpose-driven, public value-driven government organizations, but also rethinking our industrial strategy, procurement programs, really to contain this kind of design element of not just conditionality, but really what does it mean to look hard and fast at the structures on the ground and admit that the problems we have, and of course there are problems, are not just about accusing the bureaucracy or accusing about corruption, but it requires a massive shift in both mindset, but working on concrete areas like Sweden's example with the school meals. We really believe that take an area, learn from it on what it means to partner with business in a different way, learn from redesigning that procurement contract in a different way, learning by doing, welcoming that risk taking, and then scale up that learning. And that's why we talk about practice-based learning very much within the Institute, but it does mean rethinking those basic concepts of value, markets, organizations, pre-distribution, getting the conditions right from the start, not just redistribution, partnership with a purpose, stakeholder value at the center. This is my last slide in the Institute. This is on our website. It means talking about policy in a fundamentally different way, not about fixing, but co-creating, not about de-risking, but real collective risk-taking and welcoming uncertainty, and then sharing the rewards as well. Not picking winners, picking the willing, not leveling, but tilting, and so on and so forth. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, to also work with your team. And we are excited by the prospect of continuing our collaboration. Oh dear, where am I going? How do I stop sharing? It's not coming up, Busan.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Prof. Thank you very much for that insightful inputs. Let me request the Honorable President, who is here as a student of the National School of Government today, to make his intervention and reflections on your presentation, Prof. Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Busani. Principal. It's wonderful to call you principal. It's a wonderful term. And you are really acting as a principal. Let me thank you, Busani, and indeed Minister Mkhunu, for organizing this masterclass. I do indeed feel like a real student today, and let me immediately say to Mariana that I enjoy being your student. I read your books, I read your articles, either in the Financial Times or wherever you post them. I am always hungry to grab as much knowledge from what you put out, what you write. And even your latest book, I'm plowing through it. And I must say that as a student, I rather enjoyed your lecture, and I've gained a lot of insights, and I'd like to reflect on some of the issues. But I'd also like to thank your other colleagues who have joined you in this class, but also some of the colleagues who have jointly written the recent paper that you have done that reflects on South Africa. And I'm rather glad that extracting out of your book, Mission Economy, you've focused on South Africa and the lessons that we can learn. The value that you add, Mariana, both in our Presidential Economic Advisory Council, as well as your participation with us in a class like this, but also in my interaction with you on an ongoing basis, either on Zoom or telephonically, is that you offer us a global perspective on a number of issues, and certainly in as far as how we should continue navigating our way around a number of challenges that we face. And your talk and your lecture today is pivoted largely around the challenges that we face, but the beauty about your intervention is that you place it against a much broader canvas. You paint us a wonderful South African picture, but it is placed against a global background, a global canvas, where we are able to see our own country against what other countries are doing and the lessons that we should draw. So that I find very refreshing. But the other part is that quite a number of things that you put forward are practical. They are bereft of myths and ideologies, and you actually challenge myths that exist out there. And you get us to think outside the box, and you get us to look at how we can solve problems, and that is how practical your approach is. But what I enjoy most, and which emanated from your book, which continues to be a thread through quite a number of things that you say and put out to us, is how we can become an entrepreneurial state. Entrepreneurial meaning that how we can be creative, we can be innovative, we can be bold, we can be enterprising, how we can take risks as a state, but you go beyond that, and also how the private sector in our country can also take risks. And you are very critical, and I'll come to that in a minute, about the private sector, not only in South Africa, but globally, how they tend to focus more on finance and not on areas of investment that can create jobs and move economies forward. And you highlight, which is where I think your approach is most beneficial, on public interest and public value, because sometimes we don't tend to focus on that. Now, clearly, as you correctly say, the COVID moment has brought about a great moment for many countries in the world, much as some are weak and all that, states. But it's also highlighted, as Minister Mkhunu was saying earlier, the important role that is played by government, or should be played by government. It was interesting for me some time ago to read how the Financial Times, which is much more of a capitalist-oriented publication, which is quite influential globally, was actually saying the role of the state has now come center stage. And not only because we are having to manage our way around dealing with COVID, but also because what we have to do as states should go beyond COVID. We should be looking at how our economies can be more inclusive, how we can resolve the problems that have been exacerbated by COVID, the inequalities, the poverty, the degradation in our environment, and all that. So the role of government has been brought to the fore. And certainly we have found that in our own country, the role of government has been brought center stage. And as it so happens, many of our citizens look forward to government playing that key role in their own personal lives, in giving direction to the economy, in dealing with COVID, and in redressing the inequities of the past, and how to deal with what apartheid misrule in our country has wrought or has brought about the devastation that continues to affect our people's lives. So, role of government is therefore very important. And what this means is that it needs a capable state. The state has to be capable, as your talk has actually focused on that. The capabilities of the state are important. And so we need a capable state. Now, in dealing with the realities of our own situation, as Minister Mkhunu also referred to, a matter which you have become well informed about and well rooted in is not only what apartheid did, but also the challenges that we've had to face through state capture and corruption, because that state capability that we sorely need, even at this time, has been weakened by state capture. And we see it, we don't even need to explain it in so many words, and we see it. And you also touch on an important issue in your talk about how states, in addressing some problems in a number of countries, often resort to outside help, quickly resort to outsourcing, to consultants. When there's a problem and a challenge, they quickly run to people who are outside, meaning that state capabilities has been weakened. And that happens to be the case here as well. And we've seen how outsourcing has also weakened our state, and how even those entities that we tended to outsource to were themselves captured, were themselves deeply involved in the challenges that we had to face of corruption. But what corruption also did is it just destroyed our ability to get things done. Because through that, the financial capability was weakened, there was overpricing, the skills that we had within the state started migrating outside of the state and then acting as consultants in, and therefore that accountability and the discipline that is needed immediately just goes down, and there is a loss of focus. And the focus is then around just how we manage contracts. So in a way, in some areas of the state, we became contract managers, just managing contracts and also managing tenders, dishing out tenders. And may I say, in some ways, the drive was more about another objective that we sought to address, which is empowering empowering Black entrepreneurs, so that Black entrepreneurs can also do business with government, and nothing wrong with that. And in the main, they've been good, but in the course of weakening that state, we also tended to destroy those entrepreneurs by not paying them on time, because that state capability that was weakened, and as we empowered Black entrepreneurs, either women-led or Black-led, youth-led businesses, because that capability within the operations of the state had been weakened. We didn't pay them on time. Their businesses got destroyed, and therefore we then lost purpose. The purpose-driven that approach that you were talking about got diluted. And it is this that we now have to address, which we are addressing, because we become so acutely aware of it. And your presence amongst us helps us to understand better precisely what has happened to us and what we have to, how we have to navigate our way through all that. And you mentioned a very important area, which is policy redesign. We've got to redesign policy. We've got to approach what government does in a different way. We've got to bring state capability back into the state, attract talent. And that is why the drive now is to bring more qualified people into government. And people should not just be brought into government because they know so-and-so, they are well connected with so-and-so. And the beauty of this, Mariana, is that that redesign process is also starting at the governing party. The governing party is now focusing on ensuring that we get more skilled people, not just people who know others, more skilled people to be brought in, either at local government level, right throughout. So we bring in more skilled, and then we want to focus more on professionalizing the public service. Because as we professionalize our public service more and bring in well-qualified young people, we are then able to refocus the state. And that issue you talk about purpose-driven then becomes a reality. And it is this redesign that we now focusing on. And part of that, and we've got snippets of it all over, part of that is also precisely what Busani Ngqaweni is doing and Minister Mkhunu is doing with the School of Government. The School of Government has just come alive. It is the first time that a president of the Republic participates in a masterclass like this and be a student in a public way. And they have brought the School of Government alive. Many public servants are now participating in formations or interventions, manifestations rather like this, and participating, going to classes. And through that, we're beginning to redesign not only policy, but also the way that we work. And the other way which focuses also on what you have said, and your harping on this is so spot on. Getting rid of the silo mentality. You talked about Apollo 1, when there was that fire that killed those three astronauts. Let me tell you, after a 10-hour long work day, 2 days ago, I said to my wife, I want to watch a movie tonight. And I got her to sit down with me, and we watched Apollo 13. We watched Apollo 13, which also talks quite a lot about what you were talking about, the mission to the moon. I watched that and I said, that's precisely what we also need to focus on, because through Apollo 13, the whole Apollo program, the US government and NASA were able to destroy silos. They got everybody to work together. And that way they were able to finally put a man on the moon. And we are seeking to destroy the silos in government. And we are working fervently. And this idea, as I became president, I realized that one of the things that we needed to do was to reform the way government functions, because we tended to be in silos at national government level, provincial and local. And I was quite driven in saying to my colleagues, let us reform the way we work and let us get rid of the silo mentality. And we then adopted or fashioned the district development model, which had been in practice in a number of areas, but we now repositioned it and reformed it into what it is today. So through the district development model, we are breaking down silo mentality. We're ensuring that government will have one plan, one single plan that runs from national, provincial, local, district as well as the local area. And what you have said today just reinforces that. Now, the other problem, of course, that we have to deal with is the financialization of our economy. You're absolutely right. Our economy, and I guess it's not this South African economy only, has been so financialized. We're no longer investing in the productive side of the economy. We're not focusing on industrialization, on manufacturing. We're just focusing on the financial sector. And it's been growing by leaps and bounds. The profits that our financial sector has been making has just been huge profits, billions and billions. And quite a lot of that money is just in certain assets and not in assets that we would like to see producing jobs. Now, our financial sector is highly monopolized, as you might well know. Other countries will have, 10s and 20 banks and all that. We only have 4 major banks, and between them, money just rotates and all that. And yet, we should be opening up the financial sector more and more. And we need to focus on that. The disappointment for me has been in how our financial sector has managed the COVID guarantee fund that we put up, which was guaranteed by government. We put out 200 billion and said, assist the private sector, let's protect the jobs so that companies are able to operate through COVID. And through that, we should also restructure our economy, bring more Black people who've been prevented from operating in their own economy. And that has not really happened. And that, to me, is greatly disappointing. And one other area that is disappointing is that the financial sector is supposed to be the most creative. The clever guys, the clever girls and guys are supposed to be in the financial sector, and they're not coming up with innovative ideas that are going to help pump money into the economy. But on the reindustrialization side, we're making strides. We came up with the idea of having master plans for each sector of the economy. So we're beginning to focus on that. Without hogging this space forever, what we also need to reform is our procurement system. Our procurement system is archaic. And as you correctly say, procurement in any state, in any government, is one of the biggest areas of economic activity. And we have to reform it, but we have to reform it in a way that is going to be empowering to Black entrepreneurs, to Black people, so that they can have a sense that they can play a role in the procurement. But we also need to transform it so that it is free of corruption. And in the end, you're absolutely right, we need to build back better. We need to build a more inclusive economy, but an economy that is also people-centered. And we need to be engaging our people in their various formations and the economic growth that we need to engender. And in doing so, we need to engage and involve our people in an overarching way. But we also need to build, as you say, durable partnerships with a purpose, with the private sector, with the social sector, with labor, to address precisely the issues that Minister Mkhunu was talking about. And our DNA as a nation is about collaboration, is about working together, about building partnerships. And it is this that you've stressed today, that we need more citizen engagement. We need citizen engagement, as I conclude, on issues such as budgeting. We crafted a budget, and it's dawned on me that in crafting this budget, we do need the citizenry to understand the structure of our budget, so that it's not only the Minister of Finance who stands in Parliament, delivers the budget, and is the only one who understands it. We need to engage the citizenry, our people, to understand both sides of the budget, both the revenue side and the expenditure side, and also get to understand that at times we do need to make choices. You focus also on making choices. I have a beautiful quote that you've got in your article, and I want to end with it where you say, crises can act as critical junctures and be a spur for long-term social and economic change. And this is what this moment, the COVID crisis, has presented us as South Africans. And this is a time when all of us need to be working together, not pulling asunder, pulling in the same direction and utilizing this crisis so that we are able to achieve the goals that we need to achieve. The 17 SDGs, as well as the goals that we set up in our own National Development Plan, stand out there for us, not only for government to achieve, but for all of us as South Africans to work together to achieve those goals. So Mariana, as your student today, I hope you don't ask me to write an exam or a test after this. As your student
multiple
today,
choice.
Multiple choice. I really value this opportunity and want to thank Bosani and Minister Mkhunu for making this opportunity available. So I'm enormously enriched by what you had to say to us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those insightful, reflections. We will have you, close in the next few minutes. We've got a question from Minister Delil. So we will take, in terms of the order, we will take the question from Minister Delil. There's a number of questions that are on the chat platform. The colleagues from UCL will be answering some, and then ministers can also choose to answer some of the questions. So it will be Minister Delil, Minister Mandashe, then we will go to the colleagues from UCL. Minister Delil.
Good morning and thank you. Good morning, Mr. President, colleagues, and the panel. Prof, I've listened very careful to what you have said. Still trying to get a copy of your book in South Africa, but we are being successful in tracking one down. But, and you mentioned the word design several times in your presentation. And what I want to add to your thinking of design is that, are you aware about the design-led thinking faculty at the University of Cape Town, which we are currently working with? Because there's design-led thinking around designing for human beings, designing for the people that we need to serve, designing to solve problems, for instance. Our first program with the University of Cape Town on design-led thinking is, for instance, how to use design-led thinking to look at the design of frequently built public assets. And my experience with the methodology of design-led thinking, it is a very simple process, but in the end, it also helped to break government out of the silo mentality. And I will propose through Minister Mkhunu that at some stage we must look at bringing in the design-led thinking methodology as a training course as part of the School of Governance, because it is very practical and it is advisable that all government decisions and programs, that we need to overlay our decisions and programs with design-led thinking. So I just wanted to find out whether Prof is aware about this design-led thinking school, because it fits in perfectly with what you are saying in your book about redesign, co-create by redesigning. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Minister Mantashe.
Ndate Mantashe, principal.
That matter, I've got your student number, you know, so.
Okay. It's quite an enriching session that we've set through, but there are a few observations I want to make. I think the biggest source of weakness in government, let me put a disclaimer first, I'm not an experienced person in government, Busani. Very new, but learning very fast. One of the weakest points for government is silo and power. That every issue that comes to government is put in a particular silo, and the power is used to keep everybody out. That is the biggest source of weakness in government. We don't have the ability of looking at a coherent vision that inspire innovation and action. Instead, we are forced to comply. And this forced enforcement of compliance kills thinking and innovation in all other centers of government. You know, you can think innovatively, try to do things differently, try to drive them, but in terms of the protocol, it can't go past this, it gets killed. And in my own view, I think until we deal with that issue, we're not going to go very far. That's why, for example, if you look into how we do things, we're piling the expenditure side of the fiscus. We increase spending all the time. Very little investment on productive economy. And therefore, in a way, without thinking about it, kill generation of revenue for the very fiscus that were piling with a lot of expenditure. That thinking is a function of what I call is silos and power. If power is on the expenditure side, all the time our decisions will go to spend money and spend more. And therefore, that translates in raising more loans, because the productive economy, we don't invest in productive economy. The last point, or second last point I want to raise is, at a point, Busani, we must have a session that deals with this transition. Because transition in a developing economy cannot be modeled on the transition on developed economy. Because if you go to developed economy, you can take it like Germany, which says we move out of coal and come back and say, no, we're extending that period to 2038. They said we're killing it. And then you come to a developing economy. Instead of systematically increasing low carbon emissions, you can be told to move from high carbon emission to no carbon emissions. Because I think it is a function of what I call encirclement, where small economies are conduits of ideas of developed economies. And we have no space to think. And I think that space we must protect and think and take the journey, which transition means. That journey, we take that journey in a way that will not kill us. The last point is inclusivity and sustainability. For an economy like ours, which come from apartheid, inclusivity is at the heart of everything we do. But in terms of investors, it's an irritation to try and involve as many Black people as we can in the economy is an irritation for investors, who will all, in the majority of cases, come from developed economies. So we must think innovatively on how to overcome all those challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for that. Prof, let me go back to you. You will decide which some of the questions to answer and to share with the other colleagues.
Sure. So first of all, thank you to both of you. You've hit, you've gone to the center of some of the problems. And First Minister Dalil, as the Minister of Public Works, I love the fact that you bring up design thinking. That's actually cross-cutting across the 4 modules that we have. But that 4th module I mentioned about design, and especially designing, a design-led approach at the center of how we govern things like digital platforms is very different from thinking of the digital platform as just out there and then having to use it for something, right? So your focus on that term is really important. I was at the UN Habitat meeting just before COVID struck. Actually, I was with President Ramaphosa just before COVID struck last March in Pretoria. But the month before that in Abu Dhabi, there was a big conference on cities and transforming cities as places where to think about green transitions. And the president of Afghanistan spoke, and he said something that was very interesting. He said, we need more design thinking and less of an old school planning mentality. What he didn't say, which I think he meant, was we also need a design thinking to how we plan. So, both your ministry and of course that also around mineral resources of Minister Mantesha have to plan. But what does it mean to do it, as you were saying, with the design thinking way of bringing also in terms of the co-creation that I was talking about at the beginning, but also as President Ramaphosa said, to make sure it's good for people, we need things like, there's a women's budget group, for example, in the UK government, which every time the budget comes out, before it's actually officially announced, we'll look at it in terms of how it actually will affect all sorts of different women from different class backgrounds, from different social and economic conditions, from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And we need more of that, for everything, which is people focused. So a people focused design-led thinking approach to planning and to a green transition is a very specific point. I'd really like maybe Reiner Cattell to come in on that, and Antonio Andreoni, perhaps also a colleague, on the second question by Minister Mantesha, which really goes to the core of what does it mean to not just talk about the amount of public money, but the structure. And your point that this isn't about copying the developed world, but really also having a South African specific context through which to do it. I think Antonio has very interesting things to say about that. So Reiner, can you
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Somehow my video doesn't work because of the host has
we know you're beautiful.
Yes, well, you have my picture there. Oh yeah, and I can start my video. Yeah, hi. Yeah, so I think that as Mariana said, I think that design thinking is really very much about the idea of learning in policymaking. And as we heard so much today, how do we make learning in policymaking quicker, actually, rather than wait for 5 years and evaluate policies? How do we make this evaluation and learning part of the everyday policymaking? And I think this is also very much about how do we make policymaking more local, rather than high level top down, but how do we actually empower local governments? And as President also mentioned, the Rethink Initiative, for instance, I think is a great example of that. So how do you actually decentralize and make policymaking more local and more experimental, which is really what the design thinking can bring you. And as Mariana said, for us, the design thinking is really cross-cutting through all the modules, but and really central to our work. Yeah, I think that's it from my side.
Antonio?
Thanks, Mariana. No, I will try to be brief. I mean, one point I would say, first of all, is both comments are very much interconnected because, of course, understanding how to design policies in a specific context means understanding the structure of the relationship between the players in that context. I've been involved over the last few years in a number of projects in South Africa, first in the evaluation of the manufacturing competitiveness enhancement program, more recently in one of the master plan for the mining equipment industry. And of course, we need to understand where the opportunities really are. And as Mariana emphasized, what type of coalitions of interest and willing can be built around opportunity that exists. And I think we too often emphasize the challenges, and we do not see actually the significant amount of opportunities that exist in the South African context, especially in a number of sectors where South Africa has developed over the year significant type of productive technological capabilities. I spent quite a lot of time visiting several companies in the country, and there are very good experiences of that positive engagement also with international players. The challenges are still there. So I think Mr. Mantascia is probably referring to also problems in terms of implementation of local procurement or local content type of requirements, and the difficulties in structuring businesses and businesses propositions that are feasible in the current context. The last point I would like to add here is it's critical to understand how, and here I think again we are linking up both what Mr. Mantascia and Mrs. De Lille raised, the fact that there is need to push resources both in the public and private sector towards investment. And Mariana mentioned how financialization has not been only in the financial sector, but also in the manufacturing sector. So if the manufacturing sector is not creating jobs, is not investing in the medium long term in transforming its capabilities, there is no hope for sustained economic growth and inclusive growth. And this is, the data that we've been working on for many years make a clear recommendation. There has been a dramatic premature deindustrialization in the country, which has really weakened its capacity to be inclusive and to build the future in terms of more sustainability. So I think here there is really lots of work to be done on the ground, and there has been lots of initiatives that I think are already going in the right direction. And we don't have time to enter into here, but I think across the industrial competition policy, technology policy, skills policy, there are lots of opportunity there to align them better to achieve the type of outcome that the President has highlighted in his remarks. Thanks, Mariana.
Thank you, Antonio. Mariana, you want to make a summary of all your parting reflections?
Sure. Just before that, Kate, who's been a real leader in this whole executive education program we did with you. Kate, did you want to just come in and make any reflection before I close?
Yeah, thank you for this, Mariana. Maybe just a quick thank you. We work with public servants all over. We work with lots of students, including one who's joined us today in the audience. But working directly and closely with public servants like those through the National School of Government enriches our thinking, our research, our teaching. And so, I'm glad to hear this was a good experience for you guys, but it was also wonderful for us. And so we really are thankful for this opportunity and to have this session as well. So thank you.
Great. So, I cannot say anything more in terms of the thanks. It's been very much in terms of what we call practice-based theorizing. There's no lack of professors who profess, hence the name professor. There's fewer that actually really engage, with communities of practitioners on the ground in a humble way that bring it back to the theory. And that's what we try to do. We need to change our own way of thinking based on the experience of working with you, hearing your reflections. These last two reflections are just a perfect example of, not just the problems you're facing, but how you're going about thinking about it, both the challenges and the opportunities. Just, the big question right now, I think, that is so relevant to South Africa is doing kind of two things. One is the urgency of actually investing and spending money in ways that actually reach the very difficult situation that citizens are facing and that firms are facing. The second is designing that and structuring it in such a way that really does build back better. So it's not just a flood of money going in, because we know that didn't work with the financial crisis. There was no lack of money that came in after the financial crisis. Unfortunately, we did not build back better. And many countries like the UK and the US have record levels of private debt now, private debt to disposable income, because of how we structured that massive, increase of liquidity. And similarly, it's not just about pouring money into new infrastructure, because many countries have problematic or sometimes little infrastructure. It's designing within those, infrastructure projects a view of what kind of society do we want? What does it mean to have a green design view of public infrastructure? And I'm sure that Minister Dalil is thinking about this very much, it sounded like. So I think the opportunity in South Africa, also in terms of the history of apartheid and your own reflections on how that itself is both an opportunity, but also a challenge in terms of how particular design of the system got made, which, as President Ramaphosa was saying, also led to different types of incumbency effects and inertia. This is, that moment, that triptych moment of investment is needed, designing that investment to build back better, but landing it in a humble way, learning how to structure our public organizations in a different way, which the National School of Government, but also it sounds like the Cape Town Design, school. And I know in Johannesburg, of course, there's a very important school of government. How do we learn how to actually structure these organizations in such a way that really are purpose-driven with notions of public value at the center? You cannot have any one of these three things done alone. Organizational change, directing investment for a better economy, but also nesting within the contracts of public-private relationships, issues like those conditionalities. I think they're incredibly relevant to South Africa, and working with you, hearing your voices, but also after this course, working with you on some kind of concrete sandboxes, as we call them, policy sandboxes, learning how to do something really differently, like the school meal program, and then scaling it up across the board. I think that's the real opportunity. So thank you for allowing us to be here with you. And really looking forward to the continued collaboration. And thank you, President Ramaphosa, for being the visionary leader you are. I always learned from you, your style. I think only Obama has a cooler style than, the style, the grace, your willingness to listen to both the theory but also the nitty-gritty practice is a real refreshing thing for us academics to be engaging with.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you for that. Well, the National School of Government is a partly, self-funding institution. So I have to end my upkeep, because my colleagues will actually get me into trouble. We do have this executive program that Mariana has spoken about. We are now recruiting the next intake for it, senior managers, as well as members of the executive, members of parliament, and members of local government, institutions are free to come and join this program. And we are fundraising so that your participation in this executive program can be, affordable by yourselves or by the departments or institutions that you work for. We also are recruiting for ETELA, which is a flagship executive leadership program. We open now, we're starting in the next 7 days, and the economic governance program, which we are doing with the VET School of Government, will be coming again in the second half of this year. So our doors are open. We are now taking students. We do charge a fee in order to maintain our upkeep as a National School of Government, but I can assure you that our fees are actually very reasonable. Let me request one of the students of the program, which ended yesterday, the first cohort of the executive program, we are doing with the UCL, and this is the DG of Gauteng. She will come and do a vote of thanks, and while she does that, I wish to request all the colleagues who are participating in that program and others who are here as participants who show their videos whilst DG is making a vote of thanks. DG, and if everyone else can show their videos. Thank you. DG Gauteng, are you there?
I am here, Principal. Thank you very much. To His Excellency, the President Cyril Ramaphosa, Honorable Minister Mchunu, Deputy Minister Chikunga, all the ministers, deputy ministers, premiers, MECs, mayors, councillors, directors, general HODs, heads of other entities of government, and all colleagues on the call. Mahatma Gandhi says, you must live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you were to live forever. I'd like to pass thank yous and a word of appreciation to the President for leading the vision of thinking differently, particularly focusing on building a capable state and an entrepreneurial one at that. Minister Mchunu for piloting the learning public service, such as we are going through now. To thank the presenter, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, as well as her faculty. I think the President eloquently stated how the presentation today helps us as a country to do some of the things that we would want to do. Suffice it to say from my side, I love the way in which the presenter has reconciled what are apparent contradictory universes, the universe of entrepreneurship, as well as that of statecraft and government. They've demonstrated that it is possible to think and do things differently, even at this stage. Would like to thank them greatly for that, for the sponsors who have made it possible for all of us to attend. We would like to thank them. Principal, I'd also would like to thank the organizers from the National School of Government, capably led by yourself. Thank you indeed, as the President says, for having rejuvenated the National School of Government. I would like to join you by urging all our colleagues to make sure that they work with yourselves and rather pay that money for training to the National School of Government as opposed to who we pay to now. I'd like to thank all the attendees for having made time, particularly the very famous student who attended today. It is important that we take time, retreat, and think about the big, hairy problems that we sit with as a country. Principal, thank you very much. See you all on the moon, having sorted out all our big, hairy, wicked problems of the Republic of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, DG. Well, the DG of Science and Innovation is preparing to take us to the moon very soon. So we're quite hopeful. Thank you once again to everybody for being here. We will meet again soon. Please look out for more adverts of the masterclasses that we are planning as a National School of Government. And hopefully you will be able to engage with us on those. Thank you and have a good afternoon further. Thanks, Mariana.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And this is only the beginning.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.